All right, well, thank you all again so much for joining us. My name is Haley Lewis, and I'm a program associate for the Stevens Initiative. I want to start by thanking Andy Schaefer, my colleague who's helped prepare for today's webinar, and for our three speakers who I will introduce in a bit. I think today is going to be a really great conversation, and I'm glad that you have all joined us. The Stevens Initiative was founded in 2015 in honor of Ambassador Christopher Stevens, who dedicated his career as a diplomat to connecting young people from different cultures and backgrounds. We work to give young people the knowledge, skills, and experiences they need to prosper in an increasingly interconnected world. The Stevens Initiative is sponsored by the U.S. Department of State, and that includes funding from the US government, and we're administered by the Aspen Institute. We're also supported by the Bezos Family Foundation and the governments of Morocco and the United Arab Emirates. When the pandemic began earlier this year, I don't think any of us really knew what was ahead. But the Stevens Initiative team did know one thing, that as schools were going to transition to distance learning, and as youth programs were canceled, virtual exchange would be a powerful tool for schools and institutions around the world. Through virtual exchange, young people can have access to different global education opportunities that allow them to develop skills and to do something that I think we all are in need of right now, which is to connect with their peers despite canceled in-person programs. And so in the spring, we launched the Stevens Initiative response to the coronavirus pandemic. And as part of our response, we had a fund in which we named 18 Coronavirus Response Fund grantees. And some of those grantees adapted their existing virtual exchange programs to accommodate different changes caused by the pandemic. Others spent the summer planning for virtual exchange programs that they'll implement this fall, and that included them training different educators for those virtual exchange programs. And then finally, a number of our grantees, including those represented here today, transitioned their in-person programs to virtual exchanges. And together, these 18 grantees will reach nearly 4,500 young people across the United States and the Middle East and North Africa. Today's speakers, Chad Detloff from Global Education Benchmark Group, or GEBG, Sarah Martin from Global Ties Kansas City, and Brian Peckrell from World Chicago, we'll talk a little bit more about their virtual exchange programs. Before they do, I want to share a little bit more about how the Stevens Initiative defines virtual exchange so that we can all start today's conversation with the same foundational information. And so I'm going to read this on the screen to all of you, and then we'll start our conversation. Virtual exchange uses technology to connect people for education and exchange. Virtual exchange programs typically serve young people. Many virtual exchange programs are international, connecting participants in different countries to help them gain global competencies, among other knowledge, skills, and abilities. We believe that virtual exchange should also take place over a sustained period of time where participants are interacting regularly. We also believe that virtual exchanges should be facilitated by trained facilitators, whether those are educators or someone else. And so now I'm going to ask the speakers to turn on their screens or their cameras. And while they do, I want to let you all know that at the end of the discussion today, we will be answering as many questions as we can. And so please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. All right, so I would love to start by just asking all of our speakers to introduce themselves. You should have received their bios and the program materials sent prior to this webinar, but I would love to learn a little bit more about you all and your virtual exchange programs. So Chad, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Chad Detloff, and I am the Director of Programs and Curriculum for the Global Education Benchmark Group. We are a small nonprofit that supports the schools around the world in making their global education programs more thoughtful, more thorough, and more accessible for students. We work with over 150 schools around the world. Our program this summer, which we're very grateful for the Stevens Initiative for its support, was to bring students in the US and in Morocco together to talk about the UN Sustainable Development Goals with the objective of intercultural communication at the heart of that program. And we ran 2 3-week-long programs, and I'm sure we'll share more about those as the conversation progresses.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Sarah Martin. I am the program manager at Global Ties KC. So we are a nonprofit located in Kansas City, Missouri, involved in the facilitation of international exchange and collaboration. We're super thankful to be a part of this discussion and kind of talk about how to keep exchange strong when we move to virtual and kind of see where things go. This summer, we implemented a 3-week virtual exchange program for students between Casablanca, Morocco, and Kansas City, Missouri. So we partnered with 2 youth-based organizations and each of those cities who encourage art and specifically performing art within their participants at those organizations. So our program was initially and ultimately a shared collective of artisan talent. So we connected hip hop artists and so that they can create a video art project by the end of the 3 weeks.
And Brian.
Thanks, Haley. My name is Brian Pecker. I'm the Vice President at World Chicago. World Chicago is a local not-for-profit that connects Chicagoans with the world to create linkages of mutual respect and international relations. We were honored to work with the Aspen Institute and the Stevens Initiative on our exchange. Our exchange connected 25 youth from Chicago and Kansas City with 25 youth in Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia to explore design thinking and social entrepreneurship over 3 weeks. Using the skills that they developed through our exchange and our open source curriculum, the youth theorized potential projects that could solve the problems that face youth in the Middle East as well as the United States. They created these joint ventures together and then presented them to a team of experts at the end of the exchange.
Thank you all. So obviously there's really a lot to consider when transitioning a program from an in-person exchange to a virtual exchange. And so I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what you all were thinking about when making that transition, and if there were any sort of challenges or opportunities that you were expecting throughout your planning.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk about that. So at least for our program, I think what I thought about the most before we began it was, how do we keep those same amazing connections that you get with an in-person exchange? You know, because if anyone's seen an in-person exchange, I mean, you can sometimes feel the amazing connections and the bond that the participants make with one another. And that was really the purpose of our program anyway, was to provide cultural competency skills and global learning to these students who previously haven't had that experience. So I kept thinking, well, how do we simulate that? And I think one of my biggest concerns and obstacles was thinking, well, we have 3 weeks together and they're only doing synchronous, or, you know, they're only in Zoom calls with each other when they're talking in live time, about 3 hours between those 3 weeks. So that was a new challenge for me. And so what we were intentional about when we originally designed our program was, well, let's start them with an advantage to creating that bond. And that's why we were intentional to create a program that connected these hip hop artists or these performing artists, because that way they immediately started with some sort of connection. They immediately had something to understand and to connect on that really sped up that initial bonding time. Since we kind of lost it with the virtual component, you can't have them together 8 hours a day, like the exchange programs I've been involved in have been in the past. So that was one of our main obstacles, and it seemed really effective. I think even the first day after our Zoom call, there was an exciting feeling in the air, and you could tell that they were leaving very motivated to continue getting to know one another. So that was kind of one of our first thoughts was, well, how do we create those same amazing connections? And then our solution to it.
I'll jump off and continue with a little bit of what Sarah was discussing. Certainly our program in its original iteration would be a 100+ hour 3-week engagement in Chicago, in which there'd be ample time to have reflections, debriefs, and discussions that would promote that citizen and cultural exchange. With this virtual exchange, we had about 15 to 18 hours of synchronous learning together. And as a result, every single interaction had to be more concise and more intentional in structure. We found that developing a solid technological structure and framework was essential to the program's success. As a result, we used a Google Classroom, and it was very structured about what would happen in each session, what would happen basically down to the minute. It was well produced in that frame, as well as thinking about the technology that we would use to promote asynchronous learning. Just because the students aren't together with us doesn't mean that they can't have those dialogues and reflections. So we use products like Flipgrid, promote a discussion and debrief and reflection outside of the traditional synchronous or together learning hours. Using tools like that, we were able to continue to promote the same type of dialogue, debrief, and reflection that kind of synthesizes that cultural exchange.
So the Global Education Benchmark Group, as I mentioned before, is a nonprofit that empowers schools to be doing this work. And so we're in a slightly different position in that we work with a number of different schools around the world and had convened these schools to help their students travel over summer times for a number of years as part of our mission to empower the schools to do that work on their own. And so we have been running a program with schools in Morocco for a couple of years where predominantly US students would be traveling to Morocco to do some intercultural learning and to learn about history and culture of Morocco. And as Brian said, that program was a very condensed program that was mostly in person and therefore sort of immersive in that sense. As we were thinking about shifting it into a virtual space, as Sarah was saying, we were trying to make sure that we kept our focus on the goal of the program, which was this intercultural learning. But it also allowed us to think about some of the opportunities that were very difficult in an in-person program and to take advantage of those, and then also to perhaps avoid some challenges that we had in the in-person program and to capitalize on again, the opportunities that virtual would provide. So for example, we kept the curriculum focused on intercultural learning, and we fostered dialogue through the synchronous sessions. But we backed off a little bit on some of the more traditional historical learning about Morocco, because instead of it being predominantly American students traveling to Morocco, we now had this opportunity for more mutual connection between and among all of the students. Furthermore, instead of having just one group of American students who might be from a particular region or place, we were able to draw upon students from all over the US and all over Morocco. And so there was a much greater opportunity for nuanced intercultural understanding among the students instead of just a sort of bilateral cross-cultural dialogue. And so we were able to get into conversations that went far beyond what it is to be Moroccan or what it is to be American, and had much more to do with regionality, with age, with family structure, with belief systems, which, for our goals, again, were really enriching and in many ways more meaningful than what we were able to do in the in-person program.
Chad, just to build off sort of something you were talking about, and I think that others touched upon as well, an in-person exchange program is often a one-sided learning experience where a group of people go to another country and the goal is to learn about that country and that culture, whereas virtual exchange is bringing people from all different places together they have this shared goal of learning. And so I think that that kind of impacts all aspects of a virtual exchange program when you're planning and implementing, and one is partnerships. And so can you share a little bit more, all of you, about what you were considering when creating these international partnerships for your virtual exchange, and what role your partners played throughout implementation? And was that role any different than it would have been for an in-person program?
I can kick it off just in saying that, similar to what I said before, one of the components that we didn't want to change because it was working so well was our primary partnership with an organization that we had worked with for a number of years as we were taking those students to Morocco. And we were fortunate because we had a partnership built on trust, and we organizationally have a partnership framework that has some characteristics of strong partnerships that we were seeking to employ as we were continuing this partnership. And therefore that allowed us to not have to worry too much about developing a new partnership or sort of those best practices associated with a partnership, and rather to use the strength of the partnership to focus on the areas in which we did need to pivot. Those, again, being more sort of curricular in nature. One thing that I think we did realize as we were needing to re-examine our partnership to some extent was that there was a lot more clarification of roles and responsibilities that happened or that needed to happen in anticipation of the virtual program. As we all know, when you're collaborating in person with folks, it's a lot easier to pick up on some of those cues and to understand some of the sort of intercultural nuances of who's going to do what and how is that all going to work. Whereas in a virtual space where we had, 2 different organizations that were partnering, and then in addition, 30 different schools, and each of those schools has a faculty member associated with the group of students, there were just a lot of people in the room. And so to make sure that we were providing the students, first and foremost, with a meaningful experience, we needed to make sure at least the adults knew who was doing what, who needed to be there at what time. And that went from, the very top of this partnership between our organization and our partners, as well, all the way down to the schools that were partnering with one another within the exchange itself.
For World Chicago, a virtual exchange is somewhat different than some of our physical exchanges, as it exists between 2 places, in between the United States or Chicago and the MENA region. As a result, it was important to find a partner that brought the same level of social capital from the MENA region to the table as we bring from Chicago. And not just that, but also treating that organization with a high level of equity and trusting their determinations that the people that they were bringing were complementary to the resources that we have in the Chicagoland area. So certainly entering into a relationship with an equitable mindset was important to our success, but having a lot of discussions around recruitment and participant selection was also important. Certainly because the exchange exists between two places, having participants that are motivated by the same qualities, the same outcomes is quite important to the success of the exchange. So we found that we were constantly having discussions about what are our participants looking for? What do we keep hearing in our applications? What are the types of elements that are important to these students? And continual collaboration around that ensured that our participants, both on the Chicago side, the United States side, and the MENA side, were aligned and equitable.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what both Brian and Chad have said up to this point. For Kansas City, we had a little bit of a unique situation with our facilitators. Our program was actually revolving around our Moroccan facilitator. And this Moroccan facilitator was actually a Kansas City Global Ties KC program alumni in September 2019. So we already had a pre-existing relationship with our facilitator, which was instrumental in the success of the program. And not just that, but we intentionally chose our American facilitator, who was someone who the Moroccan facilitator met with while in Kansas City. And they had established a wonderful relationship. They were very good friends up to that point. So we felt comfortable moving forward with a program that we knew the facilitator, both the facilitators, and they knew each other. So there was already this well-established relationship and the sense of trust going in, which is instrumental. And I think that's primarily what Brian and Chad are saying, that you have to have some sort of trust and an understanding. But I also want to point out that I know if you haven't done a virtual exchange before, if you haven't implemented this, you know, as like the primary funder before, then it can be really hard to determine like, well, who can my partners be? I want to do a program, I have the students, I have the curriculum, but who do I reach out to? And I think at this point, it's just understanding what your values are, what your purpose is, and then finding someone who aligns with it, just like they're saying. And that, you know, with research and due diligence, and we're all within an amazing network who knows the right people, you know, utilizing situations like that where you can get to the right person and they exist, but making sure that there is that like trust and the sense of equity, just like Brian said.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think, you know, as part of my first question, you all talked a little bit about the importance of optimizing the engagements of participants because their time together was so limited. And that obviously has a huge impact on group dynamic. And just like with your partners, when you work really hard to establish that trust, the same is going to go for your youth participants. And so I'm wondering if you could all talk a little bit about how you established trust for your participants and also how you ensured a good, strong group dynamic throughout the exchange.
I can start. The production of our exchange was pretty crucial in establishing trust between our participants. With a physical exchange, production value is not necessarily the most important thing. It's the creating spaces for people to meet. But within our exchange, ensuring that when we were as a team, everyone had the opportunity to talk, and that when we broke into breakout groups, that there were opportunities for rich conversation between individuals that hadn't had the opportunity to talk before became tantamount to the actual exchange itself. So we spent a tremendous amount of time structuring when there would be breakout groups, who would be in those breakout groups. Then once the exchange began, ensuring that once it became time to have those discussions, those crucial discussions, that there was no time wasted between the conversation as an entire group and then the smaller conversations. And because of that, the students didn't see the back end side of our work. They were just present to the content and the conversations, and as a result, they were able to establish these very strong relationships in our 3 weeks together. So much so that when the exchange was ending, they were, you know, becoming emotional about the connections that they had formed. So I think you have to be very intentional about the production of your exchange and how you're going to create these opportunities for exchange and engagement.
Yeah, absolutely. I've said before that the trust issue and ensuring that there was a trust within the program was like what kept me up most about this program as I was creating it and implementing it, because I was really wanting to ensure that they felt comfortable and that there was able to be a true cultural exchange within the quick 3 weeks. And you can absolutely, like, there are methods you can do during the program to help you, but I also want to emphasize that there is plenty of like the structure of your actual foundation and the content of your curriculum and how your program's actually structured that also builds upon that. So some of the key ways we did this was, one, ensuring that the students had some sort of common interest, that there's something that they can connect on. That instantly helped to build trust within the participants themselves. Two, the facilitators knew each other and they had a really great friendship, which was a really wonderful example for the students of the kind of friendship that they could have as well. So two, the relationship that the facilitators had. And then three, from there, was we talk a lot and you hear a lot about how it's really important for students and participants to take the power of learning for themselves But I think sometimes people might forget that you can associate that with learning about people as well. So in any situation where we were able to put the power of learning about each other in the hands of the participants and the students, we did it. And that way they were able to buy in that much quicker about, what they were interested in learning about each other, and, engaging with these other cultures on their own terms with their own interests was key. So I'll just give a brief example, which might be helpful. One day was super, super simple activity we did our very first day. It was kind of like a popcorn question and answer, where I just asked someone a personal question. If I were to ask Brian, like, how many siblings do you have, and would you have more or less, and why? And then Brian would answer, and he had asked Haley a question. And so it just kind of goes from there. You're able to learn about each other, but they're the ones forced to ask the questions. So things like that, I think we're able to create a space where they all felt comfortable being friends, and they all felt comfortable sharing with me and the facilitators and the participants.
Yeah, I think Brian and Sarah have touched on so many of the important components of this, right? The foundation of trust that is essential to any sort of cross-cultural experience, right? If that's not there, then good luck doing all the other things that you want to do. And then in addition, the notion, right, that as a curriculum, right, if we consider this exchange as a curriculum, and we put our goals first and foremost and sort of backward design based on those, you can bake into the structure of the virtual exchange all of these different components that ensure that the trust is there, and then also is sort of being sequenced as the exchange progresses. So for us, we had, although it was difficult up front, we required that all student participants be enrolled with a faculty member from their school or community who already was a person whom they trusted. But also for us, it allowed us to have someone we trusted to pass along information and to maintain that communication and relationship with the students, which, for our numbers was nearly impossible for us to do on our own. Additionally, we, unfortunately had this shared global experience that we're all dealing with right now as a common understanding and experience. And so we use that as an entry point into some of the conversations that increasingly became more complex, more nuanced, more difficult, and more personal. Additionally, like this whole idea of sensitivity to intercultural dialogue, best practices within facilitation of intercultural dialogue, were elements of our training that we did for all of the adults who participated, whether they were sort of assigned facilitators or whether they were the adults who were more in a participant or an observer role. And again, as Sarah did, one specific experience that I think was meaningful for the student participants was what we called our Visions of Values activity, which was the second synchronous day of the 2-week experience, where students were asked to bring an image that they felt reflected their home culture. And it could be an image that they took, it could be an image that was common, or it could be an image that was rare. And to bring that to a shared Jamboard and then to discuss that within smaller groups. Another structural component that I think aided in this was that we had a homeroom group, which was the students with the teacher that they were familiar with, and then other students and teachers from their same home country. And students met in that group pretty frequently in the first couple of days. But then as we progressed through the program, the students were put into a second group, which was their sustainable development group, which they elected which of the sustainable development goals they were most interested in. And so there was a sort of national affinity, and there was also a topical affinity in these sustainable development groups. And then within those groups, in the second week of the program, once the students had gotten to know each other, once they did this Visions of Values exercise, we put them into project groups, which were groups of like 4 to 8, where there was like 1 or 2 students from a particular region and part of the US, 1 or 2 students from a particular region and part of Morocco, and together they were coming together to work on an action-oriented project that was based on the sustainable development goal that they had chosen. So as you sort of zoom out, you can see, again, like Sarah and Brian were saying, like if you sort of make it a priority that the students are given these authentic and natural and self-driven opportunities to engage in dialogue, you can build a curriculum that sort of spirals toward a more complex and more nuanced conversation, over the course of your exchange period.
That's a great example, and I think all of you have shown sort of the importance of the participants understanding their shared commonalities so that they have that opportunity to bond. Sarah, I think your example of your popcorn activity was a great kind of demonstration of the importance of activities that are a little bit more like downtime, right? And conversations you would have if you had more of those informal opportunities to engage, whereas I think, Chad, you gave kind of a really high level example of the importance of structure as well, and sort of allowing the participants to engage with one another in a more facilitated way as well, that is tied more to the learning goals and objectives, the sustainable development goals and things like that. I want to turn to facilitation and the role of facilitators, but before I do, I think one important conversation when it comes to group dynamics and trust is also language and communication style. Obviously, the participants in these virtual exchanges came from all different places and didn't necessarily share a common language and weren't all fluent in English, for example. And so can you all talk a little bit about how you considered language and communication style when you were planning the program, and if that was at all different than if you were doing an in-person exchange?
Yeah, so we can talk a little bit about Kansas City. When language was definitely a barrier throughout the program, and I think that was one of my big surprises from implementing this. We're not claiming to be the experts in virtual exchange by any means. This was one of our very first that we implemented fully from start to finish. And previously, with our experience with in-person exchange, there's been language barriers, absolutely, but it translates differently when in a virtual world, for sure. You're not able to receive those same nuanced body language. You're not able to pick up on small words and conversations as much. And so it's one of those things that that definitely needs to be addressed, and it needs to be thought of when you're even designing your proposal, your content. And I think that's something that we've definitely learned from this situation, being able to ensure that there is I'm a naturally fast talker, if you haven't noticed. And so ensuring that even going in, you're very intentional about your use of language and articulation, especially when it comes to being on Zoom. Ensuring that all material is written down and provided ahead of time before your sessions so that they can review it beforehand. It's one of those things that you're going to come up with situations and obstacles in the middle of your virtual exchange. It's impossible not to. It's not going to go perfectly, and you're going to have to adjust in the middle of it, which is perfectly fine. But making sure you're allowing yourself to make those adjustments for things such as language and communication. Because if you understand that there's a communication barrier, if whether it's culturally or actual language, then you have to be able to take the time to stop and to adjust and to reframe a few things and make sure everyone's on the same page. Because if you keep letting it escalate, then your program's not going to be as impactful. It's not going to get the same conclusion that you wanted before. So I think language goes with a huge, at least for us, when it came to our program, it also has a conversation of you have to be able to stop and adjust and be flexible to make sure you're making those accommodations. And if possible, think about it beforehand and those little things you can do to ensure everyone can fully participate and that it's equal access.
Yeah, definitely. Before we talk about facilitation, because I'm sure facilitators have a big role to play in what you're talking about, Sarah, Brian or Chad, do you have anything to add specifically about language and communication style?
Yeah, I would just say that certainly within exchanges, language is power. Those who have a native language and the exchange is being done in a native language have an ability to access information and have discussions at higher levels and higher frequencies, and it creates an equity in the exchanges. So we were pretty intentional about selecting topics and themes and examples that would give our participants a leg up or put the conversation on their turf if we're discussing a social change organization or trying to look at like empathy mapping, we might use an example from Tunisia or Morocco, something that the participants might be have firsthand knowledge of, so that they feel more comfortable having that discussion. We also relied heavily on our in-country partners to have like secondary and tertiary reflections and debriefs. So if we could kind of, in our discussions with our facilitators, know if there were participants that were having a difficult time keeping up. It did turn out that that was the case. And as what we did is we had a secondary office hours where our MENA region facilitator met with those students, had discussions, gave kind of a bullet point overview of the exchange prior to the sessions, so that they were hearing the information for the second time during the exchange, and it was more of an even playing field.
The only thing that I would add is that we, for the reasons that have been articulated already, we struggled a little bit initially as we were thinking about the modification or adaptation of our curriculum from an in-person program to the virtual, of the extent to which we would be supporting multiple languages, not only sort of philosophically, but how we might do that structurally and technologically. And we realized, as we were speaking with the folks who were involved in the program in early stages through the faculty training, we were realizing that a lot of the students for whom English was not their first language, predominantly in Morocco, but also some students in the US, that the commitment to having the exchange in English was actually part of the goal for some of the students enrolling in the program. And so whereas we had sort of an ethical dilemma around the equity of language, we realized that committing to English as a language was actually the more equitable approach in terms of providing folks with what they were looking for in the exchange. You know, we did have some students who were hoping to practice French or Arabic from the US. And it allowed us to say, you know, that would be wonderful in your breakout group, you know, as you're getting into some of these later conversations in the program, great, you can take that on yourselves, but it's not a language exchange program, right? We were able to really clearly and confidently say, this is not the primary goal of the program. The primary goal is this intercultural exchange, and we also have, you know, students who are wanting to practice their English, and so it gave us more confidence in committing to that, and then training our faculty to be ready to support that. I think additionally, just having, again, these structures where there were trusted individuals for every student along the way ensured that. And then for the faculty, we had, similar to what Brian was describing, we had a faculty lounge before each of the synchronous sessions, where faculty who wanted to could show up and could talk about, you know, any challenges or components of the program that they wanted to discuss. And that was often where we were talking about ways of supporting students who might be having difficulty just in communication in general, whether it was through those cultural references that are harder to pick up on Zoom that Sarah was talking about, or whether it was really in the structure and basic sort of understanding of the language itself. And then, you know, as educators, we tried to do our best to have multiple modalities for communication, asynchronous and synchronous communication. You know, we had a Canvas page where students were engaging in dialogue, where they could compose their responses a little bit more thoroughly and thoughtfully. And I think that helped students to feel like there was, you know, no matter your strength in the language, there was some avenue for you to engage in the program and to have your voice heard.
Great. So I want to remind everyone we're already getting a lot of great questions, and we are going to do our best to answer as many as possible. So please continue to send them to the Q&A box. And while you do, I just want to ask each of you to spend 30 seconds sharing one thing that you did to prepare your facilitators to, you know, facilitate a virtual exchange that maybe is a little bit different than if you were preparing them for an in-person program. Sarah, do you want to start?
Yeah, so virtual is definitely different than in person when it comes to facilitation. We focused on relationship building, so spending time making sure we were on the same page. We helped develop the content and curriculum together. And then from there, we also went through any situation we had, any session we had, we actually went through and we kind of did like mocks of them. So we kind of practiced each of the online scenarios before we were to actually do it, so we could experience it together.
We did everything Sarah did. I'll just take it like into the exchange a little bit. As the exchange went on, we kind of determined that our facilitators had different strengths. One of our facilitators had more experience in social entrepreneurship. They had different strengths, and we ultimately leaned into those strengths. So they took on different roles throughout the exchange and started working almost as a team teachers, where they would take on different aspects of the exchange and bring different strengths to the program. And I think that was a very effective method and model.
Yeah, I would just underscore the effectiveness of scenario-based training. You know, it's obviously something that's applicable in a travel-based program, but just flipping those scenarios into online context was very helpful in evoking a lot of the sort of things you don't know ahead of time. And so, in fact, you know, the training was not the end of this process. It was the beginning of the process for most of us in realizing, wow, we have all these questions about, like, is it actually important if a student shows up to all of the synchronous sessions? And we collectively figured out that actually it wasn't, right? If students were engaging in meaningful ways and doing the asynchronous and or the synchronous work, if their faculty, you know, chaperone slash, you know, trusted confidant felt like they were engaging in a meaningful way, that wasn't our sort of judgment to make. And so it actually empowered a lot more of what Brian's describing, right? That these faculty members felt confident that they could sort of make these decisions, not only as facilitators, but as educators involved in the program, overseeing different constituents of students. And you know, as you do with any training, we learned an awful lot about some of the things that when we do it again, and we did in fact do it twice. And so, you know, after the first session, there were all these things that we learned from those trainings and from the questions that the students asked in the tech question room, and you know, things that came up in the faculty training that we could then build into the training for the second group or build into the structure of the second iteration of the program.
Great, thank you. So I'm going to ask you all our first question. Maybe one or two of you can respond to this one. It's about cost. So there are obvious costs associated with in-person exchanges like travel and room and board. But what were some costs that you had to consider when you shifted to a virtual exchange?
Depending on the infrastructure that you use, there could be costs associated with internet, both the facilitating organization, both your partners, even the participants, if they need hotspots or anything like that to have reputable, reliable internet. There could be costs associated with interpretation. We had costs associated with monitoring and evaluation, finding the right system to ensure that we could run kind of high quality surveys throughout the exchange. We didn't use we didn't have costs for our infrastructure, our Google Classroom, but certainly if your exchange is customized in a specific way, developing an infrastructure that matches the demands of your exchange might be a significant cost as well.
Sarah, Chad, do either of you have anything to add to that?
Stipends for internet access for students who might not have it, not necessarily hardware, as we found that, you know, most everyone has some sort of access to some sort of hardware, but the reliability of the internet connection was something that we wanted to make sure that we had money earmarked for that, and that we did in fact use. And I would just say, you know, as it's been said, thinking about all of the time and energy that goes into the development of the program up front, it's a little bit more than you might expect, and more than an in-person program. And so just making sure that you have funding to support that curriculum development component, so that when the students do show up, you're really focused on the intercultural elements as opposed to the logistics of leadership.
The next question, Sarah, I want to start with you because you gave that great example again about the popcorn activity. But, you know, we talked a lot about the importance of really having this organized run of show, I think as Brian called it, right? Where like everything is well facilitated and scheduled so that the participants are able to have this seamless experience. But does that inhibit sort of the informal communication that allows young people to build these relationships? How did you all address that and ensure that that was possible still?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, just like most good things in the world, it has to happen in a balance, right? So it's one of those situations where the formal is crucial, especially if your exchange is based off like a knowledge and a learning. So Brian had a super amazing curriculum that they followed throughout the whole time. So that's naturally super structured. Ours was more of a shared connection in art and understanding and global learning, right? And so I think it goes a lot to what the purpose and the priority is behind your program. But me personally, as like a facilitator, like I'm huge on the informal connections. I'm very keen to ensure that they walk away with a greater sense of confidence, public speaking skills, and self-esteem to communicate cross cultures. And I think that's best done informally and ensuring that they have like the self-driven opportunities to do that. So that is, for me, it looks like a lot of those popcorn, self-driven activities. It is breakout rooms that might have facilitated questions or even facilitators in there, but ensuring that it's mostly powered through the student. But any chance I can have to put them in smaller groups of maybe 6 is usually like my like magic number in my head. I do it. And I think those, especially people are more comfortable in different ways, right? So me personally, like I'm more comfortable in a smaller group. So I'm actually more likely to talk in a smaller group. So I'm very particular to ensure that those students have those opportunities to be in situations they're comfortable. I think that structure is very important at the same time because you want them to walk away sometimes with a curriculum, a learning, and students react very well to structure when it comes to that. If it's done well, and it's just like Brian did, it was high production, great structure, great content. So it's a little bit of both.
We have quite a few questions about keeping participants engaged, both young participants, but also just because being on Zoom or other platforms, it's a little bit harder for engagement to continue. So did any of you have any strategies for that, or your facilitators have strategies for that?
We really, there's like 2 levels to our strategy for engaging our students. The first was to create interesting and fun asynchronous or outside the exchange session opportunities to engage. So for every session, we had basically 3 prompts that they would have to kind of discuss. One was a big question that they hoped to get out of the session. So let's just say we were talking about, we were like iteration. We were looking at like ways to ideate a solution. We would give them the opportunity to ask something that they were interested in learning about that session, and they would have to respond to each other. So, but through that, we would garner all these questions that they might be interested in responding to, and then we would respond to those questions during the session. We'd also have them come up with their own icebreakers. So a student might jump onto Flipgrid and be like, what's your favorite, what power would you want if you were a superhero? And then they would start to respond to that. Someone might say, I want to be super fast. And students would, respond to that, me too, or I don't want that, I want to be super strong. So it was an opportunity for them to kind of self-lead discussions outside of the content area of design thinking and social entrepreneurship that they could do in their own time. It was time zone ambivalent because they could respond anytime before the session about those questions, and it was self-driven, so they could discuss whatever they wanted in the area. During the exchange, we cut down on the amount of examples that we tried to do to have the end result. So in a classroom, you might have 3 different approaches. You might begin with a case study, then apply it to your own organization, all aimed at trying to get the end result. We decided to scrap any like extra examples, any extra exercises, and go straight to applying it to their own work. And the reason for that is we wanted a focused, structured curriculum that didn't waste time on outside activities, because we only had 15 hours together, and we wanted to make the most of that time and give the most time to the most important activity. And because it was their own project, it was their own mock business that they had created, they were invested in it. They picked the cause that they were focused on. They picked the product that they were going to present to solve that problem. And because of those, they were very invested in that like main core activity, rather than some type of like hypothetical or like mock case study.
Before we jump to the next question, I want maybe even Sarah or Chad, did either of you use any sort of incentivization for your participants to ensure engagement? I know certificates, for example, is something that's given. So did either of you do that?
We've provided certificates, which for some students was a motivator. I think that for us, Brian's description, right? If what the students are doing feels authentic to them and values their experience, especially right now, right? Students want to be in spaces where they can be authentic and feel as though what they're doing is making some sort of meaningful impact on the world. You know, that was the greatest sort of motivator, I think, more intrinsically. And then again, having a faculty member from their community who was there to check in with them for both, you know, good and bad, I think was a very, very helpful structural element for us.
So before we close, because sadly we are already almost out of time, I wanted to see if one of you could speak briefly about time zones and how you addressed time zones throughout the exchange.
I can talk about that. It wasn't as large of an obstacle as I maybe anticipated it being, but we were really lucky with the fact of we weren't working directly with the school. You know, we were working with a youth-based organization who was open sometimes late at night, depending on how much work was going on and what event was happening. So our participants just happened, you know, they were engaged and ready to participate when it was 6 or 7 p.m. their time in Casablanca. So, I mean, from there, it was very beneficial for us where, just like I said, they were engaged and able to participate fully later in their evening. I understand that's not always the case. And so, but I also want to point out, I was really surprised, happily so, the effectiveness of asynchronous exchange, meaning when they're not together. It's very effective, and it lets them, just like we've said a lot at this point, when they're able to drive the learning themselves, that's the perfect situation to do it. So whether you're able to have even just 2 or 3 hours of synchronous exchange, that's okay. And that's something that will still be impactful and important. Just maybe asking if they're not technically available or in the evening, asking if maybe like there could be like a compromise one day where the Americans just meet a little bit earlier than maybe school opens, something along those lines. But like I said, it's very helpful to lean on asynchronous exchange as long as you structure it well and correctly.
Well, thank you all so much for those answers. I really appreciate it. And we had so many great questions, so I apologize we couldn't get to all of them. But I do want to end on what our team calls a rapid fire question to sort of close the day with some helpful advice for everybody who has joined today. So can each of you share one brief piece of advice that you would give to today's participants who are planning to transition an in-person program to a virtual exchange? Chad, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. I would say that I think it's really natural to consider all of the logistical demands of shifting something in person to virtual. But my recommendation would be to make sure that those are secondary to your curricular goals, and to keep those first and foremost clear as day, and then to let the logistics fall into place based on what you're hoping think students will get out of the program.
Sarah?
Yeah, so I would say be flexible and be adaptable. It's one of those things where go in with a structure, go in with a clear plan, just like Brian said, minute by minute. But from there, it's not a failure if you have to change it up in the spur of the moment. It's not a failure. It's still great. The students are still getting impact from it. And it's your responsibility in a way to make sure that you're catering the program to like the needs of the participants. And you sometimes don't know that until you meet them and you're in person, and your program's still going to be amazing whether it goes line by line or not. That's my biggest thing.
And to basically echo Sarah's sentiments, develop a model that is flexible, and whether it's during synchronous learning or asynchronous learning, allow time for student reflections, because as you kind of iterate your exchange to a more student-centered model based on their needs, having ample opportunity for them to reflect and share their feedback will be crucial for kind of enhancing and improving your virtual exchange.
Thank you all so much. This was a great conversation and I learned a lot. I hope that everyone who joined learned a lot. If you are new to the Stevens Initiative, you will be added to our outreach list. We hope that all of you can engage with us on social media by following us on Twitter at StevensInit, INIT, and on Facebook at the Stevens Initiative. And I wanted to let everyone who, again, is new to the Stevens Initiative or doesn't know much about virtual exchange know that in 2 weeks, on October 7th, we are holding an info session where you can learn the basics about virtual exchange and our work. And so we encourage you to go to our website and sign up for that under our events page. And so with that, we will close. Sarah, Chad, and Brian, thank you all so much again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Haley. Thanks, everyone.